Awesome. Good morning, everybody. My name is Welford Orrock, and I am the Collegiate Young Adult Ministry Coordinator for the Baptist General Association of Virginia and helping to host our webinar, our town hall this morning. So glad that you all are able to be here with us. So thank you for taking the time to join today. And we look forward to hearing some good insights and remarks and some helpful updates from our three panelists today. We've got Dr. John Upton, we have David Washburn, our treasurer of the BGAV, and Chris Backert, National Director of Fresh Expressions. So before we get officially begin, just a couple things that I'll point out to you so that you can understand how the flow of our town hall is going to go today and some of the different Zoom aspects we're going to be using during the conversation. First, I want to let you know that this is being recorded and will be available for streaming off of the BGAV website later on this week after the meeting is concluded. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to John Upton to take our conversation today, and we look forward to hearing from our three panelists. So thank you all for your time, and I hope it's a helpful webinar.
Well, thank you, Welford. And I also want to welcome everybody to the second town hall meeting of the BGAV during this coronavirus epidemic time. We've tried to save these town hall meetings for moments when we see a large number of questions coming from across the Virginia Baptist family related to last time to the PPP issue, the payroll protection plan, how to do Zoom, those kind of things. That was the town hall number one. This town hall, we've gotten a lot of questions that have come in. We had so much material for this town hall, we actually had to divide this between 2 days. So tomorrow we will have a webinar that will accompany the town hall conversation we're having right now. It will be tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we'll post on here how you can sign up for that. And I'll tell you the purpose of the webinar tomorrow. The webinar is actually born out of many questions that are coming to us, more than we can answer in this town hall. And also based on research that Barna did even just this week. Barna this week said that 56% of pastors definitely intend to continue their digital worship once social distancing is over. Another 29%, they said they would probably do that. That means 85% of all who responded to that survey intends to continue their digital worship in some fashion once even social distancing is over. Only 3% said they probably would not do that. So we felt it would be important as we move back into in-person worship, as well as trying to continue to do digital. That's going to be a challenge and a strain on a lot of church resources to know how to do both well. So tomorrow we're going to have a webinar that's going to focus on doing digital church, which is going to be very practical, how to take it to the next level from wherever we are, and what are some resources that will help ease the stress as we try to balance those two worlds. We're living in that 50-50 space from here on out, it appears. The two panelists tomorrow, one will be Emily Upton, who is the Vice President of EBA. She happens to be my daughter. I was listening to her talk about some stuff she does in her work. She and her staff, they work with about 735 colleges and universities, helping them set up their digital world and how to do virtual tours of their campuses. I've seen about a 235% uptick in their business just in the past 2 months. But she, being member of one of our churches, has said she'd be willing to come on and help us just with some basics of how to do digital world well and the virtual experience well. And she'll share some inexpensive and free resources that churches can access. Along with Emily will be Chris Morton, who's on BGAV Fresh Expression staff. He's the media director for that, and he's the one that's been hosting the webinars that we've had, as well as the Resilient Academy that we've been doing. So he knows our church as well, and he's worked with us, and he's part of our staff. And the two of them, Emily and Chris, will be sharing a lot of information. I hope you'll register for that tomorrow and join us. Now let me just say a few things before our panelists come on. These aren't original with me. You could read these in many, many different places. But I think right now it's really important to say these things. And I want to say this to the non-clergy with us, the folk that aren't the pastors or on church staff. church leaders, your key church leaders. And I'd like for just a moment to speak to you. Right now, after so many conversations with pastors and pastor groups, you can hear in the conversations the stress, the anxiety that pastors are living under at this moment right now. Your pastors and your staff, they're asking questions. When do we reopen? When do we restart? When do we regather in worship? When does Sunday school come back? These are the questions that are pressuring them right now. Will members actually social distance if we do come back? Will those who need to stay home, will they stay home? And as leaders, would you talk to those in your church? If you're not feeling well, please don't come back to the church until you are better. Pastors are asking, have we started too early? Others are asking, are we waiting too long? Are we following all the precautions? What happens if someone gets sick in our congregation and all of a sudden it begins to hit the fellowship? How will our community respond to what we're doing? These are all questions that are keeping pastors and staff up at night. So having said all that, here's my request of you as leaders in the church. One, pray for your pastor and church staff as they wrestle with these decisions. No one size fits all. Every context is different. Every circumstance is different. Pray for your pastors and church leaders as you're sorting through these decisions. Don't feel pressure to go back before you're ready. Let people have that kind of freedom. I can say this, it's really hard for pastors to say this, but I'll say this on their behalf. Continue to support your church financially. It's important. There's been a drop off in some churches in giving. Some have seen an uptick. About 8% of churches have seen an uptick, which means the rest of the churches have either stayed the same or have seen a decline in giving. So encourage your church members to continue to support the church. I would ask that you be the positive person in the church. So easy to be critical right now and negative and be anxious. Be a positive presence in the life of the church. And the last thing I would ask you to do is write a letter of encouragement or a text or whatever form that works for you. Communicate to your pastor and staff just a word of encouragement. It's really tough preaching to a camera, and it's going to be tough talking to a congregation where everybody's wearing face masks. That's not exactly a whole lot of fun right now. So just write a word of encouragement. It's real easy to think that, well, we've done this for a couple months now, we ought to be used to it. I've heard a lot of pastors say it's not been getting easier, it's actually getting harder to do this. So just write a word of encouragement to your pastor and just let them know you're behind them 100% during this time. Well, let's get ready to move into our town hall now. We have two purposes of this town hall. The first purpose of the town hall is how do we reopen, how do we regather, how do we do the in-person church safely? We're not going to spend so much time talking about how soon to open or whether to open. We're going to spend more time about the safety feature of opening the church, and David will be speaking directly to that. Each church's context is different, their circumstances are different, and every Baptist church is going to have to decide this for themselves when that is right. So, and we'll also share with you what some churches are doing and how they're addressing this time that we're in of decision making. So we'll share with you what we've learned from different churches and not only across Virginia, but outside of Virginia as well. And I'm very grateful to David Washburn, our treasurer, who has personally taken this on and done a lot of research and brings a lot of wisdom to this conversation. So David, thank you for being our panelist on this. And as you have questions, just put those in the chat box. And if we can't answer them today, we'll do the research and get back to you as soon as we can with some answers best that we can come up with. The second purpose of the meeting is how do we, as we think about regathering, how do we not lose what we've gained during this crisis? God has brought us many churches of new audiences, whether online or digital church or drive-in experience. How do we start living in this 50-50? How do we start balancing this new world that we find ourselves in? 89% of our churches are saying, or 85% are saying they're going to continue with these digital experiences. So how do we balance return to church while maintaining digital church? And Chris Backard, the National Director of Fresh Expressions, he's our panelist, and he will lead us in that conversation. So with that, I'm going to now turn it over to David.
John, thanks for the update and the introduction. With most of Virginia moving into phase 1 this past Friday and churches now able to gather at 50% capacity, this has been the topic of conversation. I want to preface my comments by acknowledging that every church has been affected by COVID-19, and every church has been uniquely affected by COVID-19. And so as we share these things to consider, as you begin regathering, ultimately your church and your leadership is ministering in a unique context that requires you, to prayerfully, carefully, and with an abundance of grace, make the best decision for your congregation and community. So I began saying a few weeks ago that it's not how soon you regather, but it's how safely you regather. So in order to help you make the best decision you can about regathering, the BGAV has a dedicated page on our website for regathering resources. Now on this page, you're going to find a variety of resources. You'll find first a suggested process of steps that you can take to be prepared to regather. And I'm going to briefly state them right now, but I want you to go to the website at some point because you're going to find additional ideas related to each step on the website. The first thing you need to do is identify a coordinator who's responsible for regathering. It's important to be clear about, is it an individual? Is it a team? Is it a group? Who's leading the regathering efforts? And it needs to be clear about what each person's responsibilities are. Secondly, you need to prepare the congregation by clearly communicating the steps you're going to take in order to regather. It's going to be important for them to know what you hope to accomplish and have done so that you can be prepared to receive them. So you need to prepare the congregation with clear communication. You need to prepare the property. A thorough walkthrough is necessary to evaluate everything from the condition of the HVAC system to paper products. Now, on that resource page that Welford just showed you, you're going to find a facilities reopening checklist that was developed by Smart Church Solutions. It's a great resource of things to take note of, in addition to what the detail we've provided on the outline that we've created for you. So it's important that you prepare the property. And then you've got to develop a site sanitation plan. How are you going to clean before, during, and after each usage of the facilities? And again, we've got some detailed suggestions of things for you to consider in ways that you can accomplish this. Now, that's our brief outline, and you may be thinking, well, that's not that many steps. That's just 4 things to do, but there's a great deal to consider within each one of those steps. So the process on our webpage also include thoughts and ideas related to phase 1, which most of Virginia is in right now, and also phase 2 regathering. So again, I encourage you, go to the resource page for more detailed information about the suggested steps in this process and things to consider in each step. It is going to be important for you to make sure you've properly prepared in order to receive people to come back to your church, to the facilities. Now, most, again, but not all of Virginia is in phase 1. We know that there are certain regions of Virginia that have been granted a reprieve and have not yet moved into that. But since most of us are in phase 1, it is important to understand the requirements that have been placed upon us in order to regather. And these are part of the governor's executive order. And this states the guidelines that have to be followed in order to attend religious services. And so I'm going to read them to you. There's 10. Don't worry about taking the notes because we've got links on that website, on our webpage, to get you there. But the first one is that all religious services must be limited to no more than 50% of the lowest capacity load on the certificate of occupancy of the room or facility in which the religious services are conducted. Secondly, individuals attending the religious services must be at least 6 feet apart when seated and must practice proper physical distance at all times. Family members can, of course, be seated together, but that 6 feet must be maintained between family units. Mark seating in 6-foot increments and in common areas where attendees may congregate. So the church needs to actually mark them off so it can be clear. Persons attending religious services should strongly consider wearing face coverings. So note, I've gotten the question, is it required? The executive order does not require it, but the language states it is strongly suggested. Also, no items can be passed to or between attendees who are not family members as defined in the executive order. So you can't pass anything communally amongst folks. Any items that are used to distribute food or beverage must be disposable, used only once and thrown away. A thorough cleaning and disinfection of frequently contacted surfaces must be conducted prior to and following any religious service. So if you're having multiple services on any given day, or if you share space with another congregation, it's got to be cleaned before and after each usage. You've also got to post signage at the entrance that states that no one with a fever or symptoms of COVID-19 is permitted in the facilities. You've also got to post signage to provide public health reminders regarding social distancing, gatherings, options for high-risk individuals, and to stay at home if sick. Now, all of these guidelines that have to be posted are also on the link that we give you to the governor's executive order so that you can download and print all of this to put around your facilities. And then finally, if religious services cannot be conducted in compliance with these guidelines, then you can't meet in person. So again, I went through these quickly, but if you'd like more detailed information about the requirements and guidelines for religious services, you'll find a link to the governor's webpage on our Regathering resource page. You'll also find a good article from Sim Showers Law Firm in Leesburg, Virginia, that's related to churches, businesses, and nonprofits as the restrictions are being lifted. This is a 12-page PDF that they produced that's on our website. That it's just good general information about beyond religious services, but if you're looking specifically as it relates to religious gatherings, that begins at the bottom of page 4. Again, it's great information, and I encourage you to check that out. Now, to dive a little deeper, what about volunteers in your church? We all know the number of people required for worship service to be held at the highest quality possible, where you have a warm, faithful witness to the gospel that's being proclaimed. So have you communicated with your volunteers to determine if you have an adequate number to gather on a Sunday morning? You may have some that are fearful of coming back and may not be ready to volunteer. How many of your volunteers, how many of your church members are in the high-risk categories? And for their safety, they shouldn't return during phase 1 and maybe not even during phase 2. So how are you communicating with your volunteers, with the members of your congregation to assess their readiness? There's also some good surveys out there that can help you ascertain how your congregants and members are feeling about regathering, so you can determine some of their concerns that you might need to address. What about children's ministry? What about Vacation Bible School? The belief is that right now, children's ministries cannot resume during phase 1. This means children's church. This means Sunday school. Trying to maintain social distancing with that age group will be a challenge at this stage. But what about later this summer? Unfortunately, we don't have an answer for that right now, because what type of children's ministries, what type of vacation Bible school you may host later this summer, it's really going to depend on what phase we're in, as well as how your facilities are equipped to safely host the number of children and volunteers you expect to have on site. Now, on our website, you'll find good information about children's ministry in two spots. Our Regathering resource page that's been highlighted has some information about children's resources. And we also have a children's resource page that is dedicated to ideas and suggestions and thoughts about how you maintain a children's ministry while the majority are still at home, and how you can ease back to gathering and think about things like Vacation Bible School. Could Vacation Bible School become a back to school event that takes place later in the summer as we're transitioning possibly back to school? Could it be held on Wednesday nights once a week for 2 or 3 weeks? So a lot of good ideas and suggestions that you'll find on our resource page. There's also conversations about what about worshiping outdoors? Now, the governor's office has not given any specific guidelines pertaining to worshiping outdoors, but we know that restrictions are being eased in public spaces. He announced yesterday that Virginia Beach is now open. So the belief right now is that the same social distancing guidelines will apply if you choose to worship outdoors. So, if you're inside, family units can be together, provided that they're separated by at least 6 feet of social distancing from the next family unit. So if you choose to worship outdoors, do the same thing. Family units stay together, but make sure you're separated. I actually saw on the national news last night a park. I'm not sure where it was located in the country, but it showed a park where people were gathered, and people who maintained the park had taken what looked like the paint you use on football fields, and they had drawn circles 6 feet apart so that people knew where they could maintain that distance. So you can be creative in how you accomplish that. We've also had questions about what about singing during worship? And as one who loves music, it's painful to acknowledge that the science is telling us that singing is one of the riskiest behaviors we can engage in. We've seen in the news recently about the percentages, some as high as 80% of cases that have been contracted by choirs in churches. So the science is telling us that we really don't need to engage in that risky behavior. What about using more than one room for worship? The guidelines state 50% maximum capacity while maintaining appropriate social distancing requirements. So yeah, you can use your sanctuary, and you can use your fellowship hall, and you can use other rooms, provided you don't exceed the 50% capacity for those rooms while maintaining the social distancing guidelines. So let me emphasize the significance of the relationship between the 50% capacity and the social distancing guidelines. The maximum capacity in your sanctuary could be 250. Great, we can have 125. But then when you go into the sanctuary and you start marking off those 6-foot increments, recognizing that you may need to move every other pew or further, depending on how closely your pews are arranged, you may mark all that off and go, gosh, we can only accommodate 90 in here, not 125. It's the lesser of those. So if maximum capacity is 125, but social distancing says 95, you need to go with 95. And that applies to every room you choose to use throughout your facilities. We've also had the question about what if we're interested in starting an online campus? Not just having a presence online, but we want to take the formal step of having an online campus that we're going to maintain and minister to those folk in that way. Let me refer you to Glenn Akins. Glenn is a member of our staff, and this is his area of expertise. You can find his contact information on our website. So if you are interested in moving forward with a dedicated, permanent online campus for your church, please get in touch with Glenn Akins, and he'll be happy to walk you through and help guide you through that process. Now, in concluding my remarks, but before I hand it off to Chris, there is a delicate balance between who you were as a congregation before COVID-19 and who you are now. You've adapted to this new normal, and you've connected with people in ways you didn't imagine 10 weeks ago. Don't stop doing those things when you regather, because there are people who won't be able to join you in person because of health concerns, and you want to stay connected to them. You've made a commitment for them to be part of your congregation, and they may not be comfortable, or they might not be able to return. So please stay connected to them. And there are a variety of responses. As John referenced earlier, we're a diverse Virginia Baptist family. And we have heard from churches who gathered in person this past Sunday. I've also heard from pastors who said, we're going to take a phased approach. We've not done drive-in worship, so our first step is going to be a drive-in worship for a week or two. And then we're going to worship outside for a week or two. And then we're going to transition back into the facility. I've also heard from other pastors who are collaborating with their colleagues in a region and saying, what if we had a concerted effort to have a similar plan? We are of similar size in facilities. So what if we do a plan together that's going to maybe bring a little unity to the community? And we decide in what way we're going to phase back into worship. Good idea. There have been others who have said, we're just not going to meet until late summer. We're going to give this time to ease into phase 2 and maybe even phase 3. And that's okay. Everybody has to make the best decision possible based on the information they have in the community in which they are ministering. So let me ask one thing of you. We would value your ideas and feedback. For those of you who gathered on this past Sunday, we would love to hear from you things such as, oh my gosh, I wish we had thought of this. It would have made it so much more smooth for gathering that day. We'd also like to hear that this went really well because we did this. So we would like to get that feedback from you so that we can share it with others. And also, I also watched a pastor's video this past week when he was explaining to his congregation why they were going to wait to regather. And he said, we have worked hard to be a church where hospitality is so embedded in who we are. This is such a characteristic of who we are that we're not ready to sacrifice that component of regathering yet. So we want to wait later to where we regather. And to me, that was a great example of they know who they are. And that is informing when they need to regather. Just as there are churches who said, we know who we are and we're prepared and we met this past Sunday. There are others who know who they are and so they're going to wait. So let's support and pray for and respect the decisions that are made. Give us your feedback, your ideas, your suggestions, and realize that we really are all in this together and we all want to help move the kingdom forward. Thanks, and I'm going to pass it off to Chris Backert now.
Well, thank you, David, and it's good to be with all of you today. My task in the next few minutes is to try to address the question of how do we move forward sort of through this time into the future, and how do we take what we've learned and gained into the future in a way that we're able to keep it, to stick with it. And that also is going to mean, obviously, we don't do everything that we've done in the past. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to go through some slides, and hopefully they will be of help to you. So I just have sort of phrased what I want to talk about over the next few minutes, as this is really an opportunity to reset what our congregations do. And there's never going to be, probably in any of our lifetimes, an opportunity to do that like we have now. And it's not only an opportunity to reset, this is really an opportunity to see our congregations advance. So one of the things that has become true for the Fresh Expressions initiative that the BGAV helped initiate some 8 years ago is that now we have the opportunity where we're working with 70 some regional bodies like the BGAV across the US and Canada that represent close to 40,000 churches and 8.5 million people. And across kind of surveying all of what God is doing across a wide sort of array of the people of God in North America, I think that a lot of people are coming to the point where they're going to say, if we can move forward through this, it'll change us forever, but it'll change us for the better. So that's why it's really important that as we lead through this next really pivotal seasons, that we help our congregations really have a mindset of we want to advance through this. We don't want to be set back by it. And the interesting thing about a crisis, especially when you talk with people, even our own disaster relief people, about engaging with crisis moments, is that you generally really only have two choices. You can advance through it, or it will set you back. And so the things that we want to take forward with us in the future are the things that are going to help us get to the next place. So I've labeled this advancing through the crisis into the now, the next, and the new reality. And this is why I've kind of broken them up in these three phases, because they are different phases, right? We have phases in which we are re-entering or regathering for worship or reopening our economy. And there's at least three distinct phases with some overlap for how we as church leaders need to be thinking about the next from now till next year or two. And there's the now reality, which is the quarantine and in some cases early post-quarantine reality. There's the next reality, which I kind of labeled here as mid to late or post-quarantine to early vaccination and or immunity. So it's hard to know exactly when these will take place, but sometime this summer, until there is a vaccine of some kind. And then there's the new reality, so vaccination, immunity, and beyond. And obviously, as David said, every church and every region and part of our country is going to enter these phases in a different way. The thing that I think is really important for us in laying out these realities and what I'm going to go into next is more than likely that we are going to move forward, and is very likely we'll then move backward before we move forward again. At least that's what most of our health experts are telling us. Of course, none of us know, but we need to be prepared to move forward and backward in all of these arenas. So we're dealing with now, we're dealing with what's next, and we're dealing with the new. And the thing that I think is most important for congregations, like those of you watching today and participating, is that when we get to the new, if we don't look significantly different than we did before all of this, it is very likely that we will have a hard time bearing witness to the gospel in a full way, and even perhaps surviving once we get to the new reality. So that's why we want to make sure that we take with us the gifts and graces and treasures that we have picked up in this period of time. And so much of that really comes down to a matter of our heart and perspective on the season that we find ourselves in. So the first thing I just want to encourage all of us to do is, this is a time, and probably even daily, that we just have to recall the very reasons that we felt called into the gospel ministry in the first place. And for some of us, that's been a few years. For some of us, it's been decades. But if we don't come back to that on a regular basis, the overwhelmingness, I think, of having to deal with the complexity of this time will just bear upon us. I mean, I was talking to a pastor yesterday who was looking through all the requirements in Virginia about reopening and was calculating the amount of time it was going to take to reset up all the requirements, and to do that on a regular basis. And they were just overwhelmed by that reality. And it's an overwhelming thing. And so we have to get back to, why did God call us into the gospel ministry in the first place? And for most of us, the reason is we felt called at some point in life that we want to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we want the good news to get out. And so we have to let that be our driver in this moment, because it's the cart, it's the horse that can pull the cart. So when we go back and revisit the Great Commission, I'm just reminded that our call is to make disciples. And no matter what we do in the coming months, whether we regather, whether we meet outdoors, whether we have online church or drive-in church, or we become networks of house churches, which a lot of people are looking at the end of the day, we still have to answer the fundamental question: how is whatever we're doing translating into making disciples of Jesus Christ? Now, the interesting thing about this moment is that when we revisit the Great Commission, both in Matthew 28 and in Acts 1:8, we are reminded that our call was to go out to the world. And the unique thing about this moment is, literally, we can touch our Jerusalems, our Judeas, our Samarias, and the uttermost parts of the earth from almost wherever we are. I know of many, many stories from our Virginia Baptist churches where people are dropping in through online church from places all over the country. There are churches who are receiving members, even in this past months, from other parts of the world. And so we have to remember that this is a great opportunity. We have an opportunity from our local setting to fulfill all the aspects and the locations of the Great Commission in this time. And then we have to remember who is our co-laborer with us, right? So Jesus told us, "I'll be with you always, even through the end of the age." And I love Dallas Willard's translation of Jesus's heart in the Great Commission, when he says, I will be with you always until the job is done. So we do all this because the presence of the risen Jesus is with us, and is with us in the middle of this pandemic. And so I think that that helps us move ourselves and our churches from responding to this crisis is something that we have to do, right? So that was a great blessing for us 2 months ago, because all of a sudden, many churches across the country experience a profound level of innovation and change that they have never experienced before, and it was able to happen very quickly. So you can imagine, if you took back some of the changes that you had to implement in the last 2 months to a deacon board or congregational meeting at the end of 2019 and tried to get that passed by vote, it very likely would not have happened. But a great space of innovation and change has been opened up because we had to. We had to. But now we need to move from saying, well, we have to do this, to we're called to do this, that this is the world that God has called us to. We've been put here for such a time as this. And we're the people that God has raised up to help manifest the life of the gospel in this time. One of the things that hit me on Easter Sunday this past year, as I was watching Andre Bocelli sing Amazing Grace before an empty square in Italy, is that this past Easter Sunday was probably the single day in the whole history of the world. There's never been another day in the whole history of the world where more people heard the message of the risen Jesus. And that's the time that we live in and the opportunity that we have. So we need to move from have to called to get to. And here's a little cartoon that someone sent me recently, and I think it just sort of expresses what I'm getting at here. It just shows, here's Satan talking to God, saying, hey, with COVID-19, I closed all your churches. And God responding, yeah, on the contrary, I just opened one up in every house. And that's the eyes that we have to see for this time. I was talking with another leader in Virginia this past week in kind of a coaching appointment. And they were in a university town, and they were just lamenting the difficulty of trying to figure out what's going to happen. Are universities going to reopen? Are they going to restart? Are any students going to come back? What's that going to do? And I just reminded them, I said, you've graduated people who've been part of your church for the last 5 or 10 years who are likely disconnected in other parts of the country and other parts of our state. They're already reconnecting with you online now. So the Lord may have raised you up at a time like this to reconnect people who've been disconnected from church in other parts of our commonwealth and other parts of our country. And who knows what God will do with that on the other side of this. So we have to maintain that perspective of this is something we get to do. We get to figure this out. So in addition to recalling kind of why we were called in the first place, this is an opportunity for us to remodel, in a sense, our congregations. And that move that we have to make is from one church mindset to now we're pastoring and leading one church with multiple expressions of church. Now, in the fresh expressions world, we have been over the last 5 to 7 years really been working in what we would call incarnational expressions of church, house churches, dinner churches, other things like that. But of course, now in the last few months, online congregations, drive-in congregations. We're going to see, I think, this summer, a great proliferation of outdoor experience kind of congregations. And all of these things are now happening underneath of one kind of broad speaking umbrella. So we will become pastors and leaders of one church that has multiple expressions of church going on at the same time. And that's going to require some changes on our part because our capacity really hasn't changed. We can still work our 40 to 50 hours a week without burning out. We can't work 100. We can't pastor our congregations in the same way that we used to. And this is going to be important for our churches to be more resilient in this time. So we've been talking a lot lately about what's it look like to be a hybrid congregation. And part of that is we have to be comfortable with getting to the real core of what it means to be a church. And Rowan Williams, who is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, made one of the best statements a few years ago on the nature of the church. And he said, if church is what happens when people encounter the risen Jesus and commit themselves to sustaining and deepening that encounter in their encounter with each other, there's plenty of theological room for a diversity of rhythm and style. And I think that we are seeing the seeds of that now. So we've got a good basis for doing what we need to do. I put this graph together to help us think about the different spaces that we need to occupy to carry forward what we're learning. So on this this XY axis here, you have one continuum, which says we have attractionally oriented ministries and incarnationally oriented ministries. So for instance, when we come to thinking about cleaning our facilities, setting up social distancing guidelines, not singing or singing, whether we're indoors or outdoors, right? We're talking about more attractional gatherings. People that are thinking now about moving to house churches. I know there's actually a proliferation of churches around the country who are saying, you know what, we're going to maintain live worship online, virtually, and it's a lot easier to think about people being around other people, whether indoors or outdoors, in groups of 10 to 20 than it is a group of 100. So they're thinking about how do they have an incarnational sort of response to the moment. And in addition to that, we have now the realities of we're going to regather physically and we're going to regather digitally. So one of my recommendations to all church leaders at this time would be to think about the life of your congregation and what you're moving into in each of these 4 quadrants. What do you do that's now attractional and physical? What do you do that's attractional and digital, and incarnational and digital, and incarnational and physical? And the likelihood is, as we move through these now, next, and new realities, we're going to have to make deposits in each of these quadrants to carry forward the things that we're learning in the future. So that's something I think are helpful. And what this will do is this allows us to be more resilient, because what enables our congregations to be more resilient is the same thing that allows ecosystems or cities to be more resilient. And that's that you have a diversity of expressions of whether it's an economy, or in our case, we need a diversity of expressions of way the church gathers and scatters. So for instance, sometimes simplicity is less resilient. So you think about a password. We're all using more passwords than we've ever used nowadays. And if you go and sign up for a new service online, you have to enter a password. And let's say you enter the password chocolate, you're going to get back that's a weak password. Or you use your name, you're going to get back that's a weak password. A series of numbers in order, you're going to get back a weak password. But you'll get a reply that says to make a stronger password, you need to use a combination of uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols, something that's quite complex because it can't be broken into and taken down. And you have to ask yourself, which password is more resilient, chocolate or this one down here? And that's a little bit of why it's important for us right now to be thinking about all these spaces, because all these spaces make our churches more resilient. They allow us to thrive through this period of time as opposed to be only challenged by this period of time. Now, I want to add another layer for us as we think about the future. Some of you might recognize this diagram from I still think one of the best books written to help church leaders in all phases think about our layers of connection. And this, you probably recognize this from the Purpose-Driven Church many years ago, where Rick Warren laid out these different layers of engagement in the life of a congregation. And so one way that we can think about this is, how are we going to use these different spaces to connect with different groups of people? So for instance, I have talked to many church leaders over the last 2 months that said, I now realize that we can have our deacons meetings digitally, right? So this would be like the core, right? And that actually, they're way more efficient and they take a lot less time. So now I have all this other time that I'm going to have to give if we're regathering to helping facilitate cleaning and those kinds of things. So even if we do that, it'll probably make sense for the foreseeable future and maybe forever that we move some, if not all, of our deacons meetings to a digital space. So it's been helpful for our ministry just to even begin to think about these different layers. How can we use these different spaces to connect with the core of people that we have, and then even the wider community? What can we do as we plan ahead? So that's a little bit what it looks like for us to become a hybrid congregation. And the thing that's going to be helpful to us as we move forward is then how do we tie together these different aspects of what we're doing? So the biblical imagery for this is grafting, right? So it's taking one part that wasn't necessarily part of the original plant and then grafting it together. So for instance, you might not know this, but there's actually a plant called ketchup and fries, where people figured out how to put together, you can grow potatoes at the bottom of the plant and tomatoes at the top. And they grafted the two organisms together to make a new plant. And that is a picture, I think, of one of the ways that God wants us to thrive into the future as churches, is we're going to figure out how to graft in digital church, drive-in church, regathered, socially distanced church, and we're going to need to work on tethering all of these things together and grafting them together. And eventually, our church, as multiple expressions of church, is going to look a little bit like this. It's not going to look just like where we all used to gather in the church building, but the people of God are going to be distributed around your town and around the world, but all still interconnected to you in one sort of ecosystem. And this is a vision, I think, of the church in the future, and part of what we need to learn to be comfortable with and lean into. So let me give you an example of something from the business world that I think speaks to this. So there's a thing that's being written about a lot these days called dual transformation. And basically what they're saying is you have a company that is taking transformation A, and they're asking themselves, how do we become the best version of who we are and kind of grow among the people that we already have? So for instance, the question of how we regather into our buildings is a question of repositioning and transformation A. So how do we reach more people by appropriate social distancing regathering? But in the last couple of months, a lot of us have experienced a transformation B. We started something completely new, whether it is drive-in church or outdoor church or online church. And I know from reports across the country, there are lots of churches reaching entirely new groups of people. So we've started a whole new segment of our congregational life that's reaching all new groups of people. Now, we did that before, right, when Transformation A wasn't possible. But as Transformation A becomes possible again, we want to maintain Transformation B, and we want to find ways of linking those things together. So they call that in the business literature the capabilities link. So how do we take what we were doing and put it together? So here's an example. Transformation A, adjust to social distancing principles and practices. Transformation B, drive-in church, open-air church, house churches, the other options and alternatives that are out there for us right now. And then there's Transformation C, the capabilities link, where we start to say, okay, we probably in this format cannot preach the same kind of sermon to group A and group B. We can write the same sermon, but we know we're going to have a different kind of delivery to A and B. So we have to start thinking about how we can multiply the effects of the things that we put our hands to and the work that we do into both spheres. Otherwise, we'll totally wear ourselves out. So here is another sort of layer to this chart that I think would be really important for all of us to think about. When we used to have everything in the attractional and physical category, right, that's centered around, the church building and meeting at the church and in physical ways, we put, 100% a lot of times of our energy there. In some places where we're gauged out in the community, we're putting a little bit of our physical incarnational time out in the community. But now we have to distribute the workload that we have among all of these sectors. And this is something that's going to be really important, as John was addressing at the beginning, for our church leaders who support us to get behind us with. And so I just want to finish up here by laying this out. I think it's going to be so critical that we plan and prioritize more than we ever have. And as we start a week, we ask ourselves, in each of these spaces that we're trying to operate in, how do we do what's important and urgent first? How do we do what's important next and not urgent? And how do we let go of some of the things that are just not as important and just not as urgent? And we got to get back to the real core of what must we do to be the church in these spaces. And it's going to mean, at least for the foreseeable future, we're going to spend most of our time focusing on circles 1 and 2 here in these four different categories. Otherwise, we know as church leaders that the outer rims will end up taking up lots of our time, but they're not the most important or urgent things that can be done. So I have a lot more that could be shared as we think about the future, but these were just some things in terms of a way of recalling what God has called us to, and of rethinking about what our mental model is of what a church even looks like in this time, and how do we as leaders kind of appropriately give our time, because we only have so much time, into leading in this kind of moment.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters today for sharing. Chris, thank you for that presentation, and David for your guidance. And just circle back real quick to a little bit that has come up through our Q&A. I think most of the things that came up in our questions have been either answered in the chat or were answered through our presenters, or in some way will be answered through the resources that we've already made available on the COVID-19 and Regathering pages. Specifically questions related to concerns about singing and singing with or without masks, or singing at all. Concerns about traffic patterns in our spaces, even as we socially distance to different rooms, how we work through different bottlenecks and choke points, and also the roles of our ushers, and how they've been asked to step into maybe an uncomfortable position of having to honor the church's desire to faithfully social distance. But I wanted to see, David, is there anything else you'd like to elaborate on as it relates to those questions that have come up through the chat or through the Q&A? And then, or anything else, or also a question about signage. What would be some good ways for us to present signage at our front entrances, or whatever entrances we decide to use, that clearly communicates the expectations of the congregation as they gather?
Yeah, thanks, Welford. There was one great suggestion in the comments that I hope people saw. I can't remember who made it, but they are working towards developing a covenant with the members of the congregation, that this is how we plan to regather. This is what we're going to expect of each other, which makes it more, we're coming together to make these decisions about how we're going to regather, which could soften the need for people to take on an enforcement role, because there is great concern about how we're warm and welcoming and bringing people into worship, but if they're not adhering to what we've agreed to as it relates to worship, that's going to put some stress on people trying to attend, as well as those trying to welcome them and help folks find a place to sit and worship. And as far as the traffic patterns, yes, if you're in multiple parts of the building, you may not be able to dismiss everybody at once. And you may need to think about one way in, different way out. So that way you don't have choke points. But each facility is going to need to think through that and develop directions for people to go. Pews may have to enter at one end, walk out at the other, almost like the grocery stores. Many of them today are one-way aisles as you navigate that. So those are good points and good questions about how we come back together and again, maintain some sense of community and togetherness, but recognizing the stress that's surrounding it. Thanks, Walter.
Well, John, before we get to the kind of final updates and reminders, is there anything else that you would like to share to bring our time to a close?
Just want to thank David for all the hard work he's done in researching this and the thoroughness. I'm sure there'll be more questions as we all maneuver our way back into this new world that we're finding ourselves in. Please let us know what you're experiencing, both what has worked for you and some things you wish you had known, so we can help other churches as well navigate this time. And Chris, thank you for the challenge of thinking not only in terms of the coming back to church as we've traditionally known it, but giving us permission to think about all the many ways the church can express itself now. We have new tools in the toolbox. What a shame. God has given us those gifts. 2 months ago, we didn't even know we had audiences we didn't even know existed, are now there, and God has opened up a world for us, and it'd be a shame to not walk into this open door that God's given us. And again, tomorrow we'll come back for the webinar and talk about very specifics on how to move into more of that digital world in ways that don't quite exhaust us, and some resources. So thanks, Welford, for hosting this and producing this. You and Mary Lee did a great job in putting all this together, and want to say thank you. And for all who participated, thank you for participating in this town hall. As things come up in the future, we'll have other town halls to address those as time goes by.
So God bless, take care, and be well, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you in some future gatherings very soon.